Story 1. The Quiet Industry of 18th Century Japanese Papermaking. You are lying down now, and as you close your eyes, imagine yourself transported to 18th century Japan, in a small, quiet village nestled in the valleys of Honshu. The sound you hear is not of bustling trade, nor of swords clashing, but of water trickling gently through bamboo conduits. This is the world of washi, the handmade Japanese paper that, though humble, became a foundation of daily life and culture. Papermaking in Japan had begun centuries earlier, introduced from China and adapted uniquely to the climate, materials, and rhythms of Japanese society. By the Edo period in the 1700s, papermaking was not just an art but an entire quiet industry, involving whole families and communities. Unlike the dramatic histories of battles and shoguns, this was a history of patient repetition, of soaking, pressing, and drying fibers until they became sheets of thin, translucent paper. To begin, one must first look at the raw materials. Washi was primarily made from the inner bark of three plants: koz, paper mulberry, Mitsumata edgeworthia, and gampi. Each brought different qualities: the durability of kozo, the smoothness of Mitsumata, the natural sheen of gampi. Farmers dedicated land to cultivating these shrubs not for fruit or grain, but for bark, a resource that required careful seasonal timing. The best harvest came in winter, when the plant's sap was low and the fibers strongest. Thus, papermaking began with the rhythm of agriculture, dependent on the patience of the seasons. The process was intricate and laborious. Once the bark was stripped, it had to be steamed, then soaked and scraped clean of the dark outer layer. Villagers, often women and children, would sit together, hands reddened from cold water, meticulously removing imperfections. In this detail lies the boring, yet essential truth of papermaking. The work was slow, repetitive, and unending. A single batch of paper might pass through dozens of hands before it was complete. Water was central. Streams were diverted through small canals to provide clean, cold flow for soaking fibers. The papermakers relied on clarity. Any impurity in the water could mar the sheet. The villages that became centers of papermaking were often chosen for their natural springs. In places like Echizen, papermaking became so entwined with local identity that shrines were dedicated to the paper goddess Kawakami Gozen. Even the divine, in this quiet corner of Japan, was imagined as presiding over the act of straining pulp through a bamboo screen. The making of sheets required a sugeta, a bamboo-framed screen, dipped into a vat of water and pulp. The craftsman would move it back and forth, in a rhythm that seemed almost meditative, layering fibers evenly until the thin mat could be lifted out. Over and over, the same motion was repeated: dip, swish, shake, lift thousands of times in a day. The sound of dripping water and the steady rhythm of hands at work filled the papermaking huts, creating a kind of working silence. Once formed, the sheets were pressed, dried, and stacked. Drying often meant pinning sheets to wooden boards or plaster walls in the sun, creating rows of white squares fluttering like silent flags across the village. The sight was ordinary yet strangely profound, the quiet declaration of labor made visible. What, you might wonder, was all this paper for? In Edo, Japan, literacy rates were higher than in many parts of the world, thanks to the proliferation of woodblock printing. Cheap novels, religious texts, calendars, and educational materials all relied on washi. Beyond that, paper found countless uses: wrapping, lanterns, umbrellas, sliding doors, shoji, even clothing in the form of paper garments. It was everywhere, often unnoticed, yet essential. To the papermaker, however, this was not lofty work tied to literature or art. It was survival. Families balanced farming with papermaking, selling bundles of sheets to merchants who distributed them to urban centers like Edo and Kyoto. The wages were modest but steady, and the work, though endless, provided security. Children learned the craft as soon as they could, ensuring continuity across generations. And yet, for all its ordinariness, papermaking was also shaped by regulations and hierarchies. The Tokugawa shogunate imposed rules on production and trade, ensuring supply for the booming printing industry. Guilds controlled access, and certain regions became famous for particular types of paper. Etchison, Mino, and Tosa all had reputations to uphold, their names written into ledgers and contracts. Even in something as unassuming as paper, there was competition, reputation, and oversight. The papermaker at the end of the day would wash his hands raw from lime and water, and look upon rows of drying sheets as evidence of toil. The same motions, day after day, tied him not to glory but to the quiet satisfaction of endurance. But one must ask, how did such a monotonous craft, tied to repetition and routine, come to shape the very texture of Japanese culture? And what was it about these sheets of paper so fragile, so ordinary that made them indispensable to an entire society? Let us return now to the valley, where the paper dries quietly on wooden boards, the air crisp and still. But beyond the papermaker's hut, beyond the rhythmic swish of pulp on screen, lies a much broader world, one in which these plain sheets played a surprisingly vital role. The second part of our story shifts outward, from the slow domestic process of papermaking to the long, winding trails that carried washi from village to city, from hand to hand, across the vast landscape of Edo period Japan. From village to market, the journey of washi did not end at the edge of the vat or drying board. Once the sheets were pressed, trimmed, and stacked, they entered a network of merchants, brokers, and traveling peddlers who moved goods through Japan's finely tuned economic system. In Edo period Japan, the Tanya wholesale merchants played a critical role in moving paper from rural centers to the growing cities. These intermediaries, many of whom had long-standing relationships with particular villages or guilds, would visit papermaking communities during the appropriate seasons, negotiating prices and purchasing large bundles for transport. Paper was tied into uniform stacks using lengths of straw rope, or was bundled inside furoshiki cloth. Often, the paper would be marked with seals, proof of origin and authenticity, that added not just trust but prestige. Transport was slow. Roads were long and often treacherous in poor weather. Paper, being fragile, had to be protected from moisture and damage. Horses, hand-pulled carts, and human porters formed the backbone of this logistics chain, winding their way through mountainous passes and along rivers toward markets in Edo, Osaka, and Kyoto. The famed Takeido Road connecting Kyoto to Edo saw not just the footsteps of samurai and pilgrims, but also of quiet merchants hauling crates of paper, ink, and tools. Inns along the way would fill not with storytellers, but with tradesmen, resting before continuing on their unremarkable but essential errands. It is easy now to overlook the quiet industry that existed behind the boom of Japanese print culture. The celebrated ukiyo-e prints of the Edo period, for example, would not have been possible without thousands of sheets of washi prepared by unnamed laborers. Without their efforts, the vibrant world of courtesans, kabuki actors, and landscapes immortalized by Hiroshige and Hokusai might never have been printed. Paper and the Tokugawa bureaucracy. But washi's purpose extended beyond art and literature. The Tokugawa state was a bureaucratic machine that ran on paper. Administrative records, tax registers, agricultural reports, edicts, and population surveys were all meticulously documented on washi. For every samurai in armor, there was a clerk in sandals, copying reports by hand with a brush. In this era before carbon copies or typewriters, paper had to be durable enough to survive frequent handling. Washi's strength and pliability made it ideal for official use, and it became the default medium of record-keeping across the archipelago. Particularly valued was Torinoko, a high-quality washi used for important documents. It was prized for its smooth surface and resistance to aging. While the average papermaker might not have known where his bundles ended up, it's likely that many made their way to regional castle towns or the capital itself, where they would be inked with decisions about land, rice yields, and succession disputes. Even temples and shrines were paper consumers. Religious documents, sutras, and amulets were often printed or copied onto washi, ensuring spiritual as well as bureaucratic continuity. There is something quietly profound in this. The governance of a nation, the performance of ritual, the exercise of justice, all of it, filtered through the sheets formed in unassuming valleys by ordinary hands. The guilds and their boundaries. While the image of the solitary craftsman is romantic, papermaking in Edo, Japan was tightly bound by guilds and legal boundaries. These guilds were not merely professional associations. They were semi-regulated monopolies that determined who could make paper, in what quantities, and under what conditions. Membership was not always voluntary. In many villages, families were born into papermaking, inheriting not just the tools and techniques, but also the obligations and quotas expected by the guild. Failure to meet standards or attempts to sell outside sanctioned channels could result in punishment, fines, or exclusion. The guilds helped regulate quality, especially for papers used in official or literary contexts, but they also stifled innovation. New entrants found it nearly impossible to break into the trade, and prices were often fixed. Regional competition was encouraged only insofar as it helped define and market certain paper types. For instance, Mino washi had to come from Mino, Echizen Hosho from Echizen. Attempts to counterfeit these brands could lead to legal conflict. This rigid structure ensured the preservation of tradition, but also bound the papermakers to a predictable future. Innovation came slowly, if at all. Even the introduction of Western papermaking techniques in the late Edo period was viewed with suspicion. And yet, there was subtle adaptation. Some papermakers shifted to producing hanshi thin sheets used for calligraphy as demand increased. Others catered to the growing market for decorative papers used in wrapping or packaging luxury goods. Change, when it came, was quiet, incremental, and largely unrecorded. Domestic rhythms. Back in the household, the daily rhythm of a papermaking family was deeply seasonal. In winter, the bark was harvested and steamed. In early spring, pulp preparation began. In summer, water shortages and humidity made production difficult. In autumn, sales and transport resumed. The cycle was annual and largely unbroken. Children from a young age helped strip bark or carry water. Elderly members sorted fibers or swept the drying area. The hut itself was arranged for efficiency: vat near window, drying boards stacked nearby, storage bundles arranged by grade. Food was eaten in shifts, often near the hearth, with little ceremony. Work came first, rest second. There was pride in craftsmanship, but it was not loud or self-congratulatory. Papermaking was simply what one did, what one's father had done, and what one's son would likely do. Evenings might be spent boiling pulp or repairing tools. Lanterns made of washi illuminated the room, their faint light casting paper shadows on paper walls. It was a world in which paper was not just a product, but a presence silent, soft, and enduring. A broader connection. Outside Japan, few took notice. While European papermaking had industrialized and mechanized by the 18th century, Japan retained its slower, craft-based method. This gave washi a unique place in the world of paper that could last centuries, that resisted tearing and deterioration, that held brushstrokes with elegance. In time, foreign scholars and collectors would marvel at its quality. But during the Edo period, washi remained largely confined within Japan's self-imposed boundaries. It was a quiet treasure, preserved by routine rather than fame. Still, its influence was felt. Whether cradling a Buddhist sutra, lining the walls of a humble home, or documenting a daimyo's census records, washi helped hold together the cultural and administrative fabric of an entire nation. And yet one must wonder, what happened when the winds of change began to blow, when steamships arrived and borders cracked open? How did this delicate, slow tradition respond to the pressures of modernization? You return once again to that quiet village, now touched by something faint and knew a subtle tension in the air, like a vibration from afar. The stream still flows through its wooden aqueduct. The vat of pulp still shimmers beneath a paper-thin film of plant fibers. But now there are rumors, carried not by birdsong or courier, but by foreign ships docking in Nagasaki. The year is no longer 1770 or 1790. It is the middle of the 19th century, and change, long resisted, is seeping into even the stillest corners of Japan. With the coming of the Kurofune Commodore Perry's black ships in 1853 and the eventual opening of Japan to Western trade, a nation that had long prized its self-containment was forced to look outward. And while political upheaval and the Meiji Restoration of 1868 are often the focal points of this era, the effects rippled just as deeply into the everyday industries, the ones with no cannons, no uniforms, no headlines. Papermaking was among them. The rise of machine-made paper. The first and perhaps most profound impact was the arrival of Yoshi Western-style machine-made paper, faster to produce, cheaper in bulk, and suited to the growing demands of modern bureaucracy and printing presses. Yoshi began to supplant washi in commercial use almost immediately. The Meiji government, in its pursuit of modernization, adopted Western technologies with zeal. Modern schools, official gazettes, and new banking institutions required vast amounts of paper more than handmade techniques could reasonably supply. Large-scale paper mills, built with imported machines, appeared in urban centers by the 1870s and 1880s. They could produce in a day what a small village might in a week. For many paper-making villages, this marked the beginning of decline. Merchants turned their attention to cheaper stock. Guilds lost influence as regulations shifted to favor national industry over traditional practice. Even the art markets changed. Newspapers, novels, and government documents once printed on washi were increasingly committed to Western paper. Craftsmen who had spent decades perfecting the rhythm of the sugita were suddenly obsolete in the eyes of progress. Their papers, once necessary for life and governance, were now curiosity's luxuries of texture, not function. Struggling to survive. And yet not all was lost. Some regions, particularly those with long-standing reputations like Echizen, pivoted toward a different market, art and heritage. Rather than try to compete with mass production, they doubled down on quality. Washi became associated with beauty rather than utility. It was used for calligraphy, for restoration of ancient scrolls, for ceremonial envelopes and handcrafted stationery. In 1891, the Imperial Household Agency formally recognized certain washi producers as preservers of traditional crafts. This gave them limited protection and helped them maintain production for elite use. But the economic pressures remained intense. Many villages depopulated. Sons left for Tokyo or Osaka to work in factories. Elderly craftsmen died without apprentices. And yet in some places, the tradition held on not through expansion, but through quiet perseverance. By the early 20th century, washi had become a symbol of cultural heritage rather than daily life. It was no longer the paper of record-keeping, but of poetry and preservation. Institutions like the Tokyo National Museum and the Agency for Cultural Affairs began to invest in conserving traditional papermaking techniques. The irony was thick. What had once been dismissed as backward was now framed as national treasure. Washi in the modern world. In 1955, the Japanese government created the Living National Treasure System, formally recognizing individuals and techniques that represented the pinnacle of traditional craft. Among the earliest recipients were washi papermakers. These artisans had, against economic odds, preserved their methods through the 20th century steaming bark, rinsing pulp, shaking the sugita. Washi found new life in unexpected ways. Restoration experts across the world, especially those preserving old manuscripts and artwork, began to prize washi for its strength, long fibers, and durability. Western libraries ordered special papers from Japan for archival work. Washi was no longer provincial. it was global. Even UNESCO took notice. In 2014, traditional Japanese washi was inscribed on the representative list of the intangible cultural heritage of humanity. The small paper-making villages of Echizen, Misumi, and Higashi Chichibu, once overlooked and slowly emptying, were now the center of international attention. Tourists arrived, documentaries were filmed, workshops were offered to curious foreigners hopping to learn the ancient rhythm of dip, swish, lift, press. And yet in many ways the practice remained the same: cold hands in mountain water, white sheets drying in winter sun, silence punctuated by the sound of dripping pulp. Reflections on endurance. In the modern age of high-speed printing, digital screens, and throwaway culture, washi offers something countercultural: a quiet slowness. It reminds us that value can be found not just in innovation, but in endurance. Every sheet of handmade paper carries the fingerprint of time, the patience of tradition. It whispers of grandmothers who scraped bark with blunt knives, of sons who trudged through snow to collect water, of fathers who counted income not in coins, but in weight of fiber and thickness of sheet. Washi's story is not dramatic. There are no battles, no betrayals, no empires fallen or queens deposed. Instead, it is the story of thousands of ordinary people who repeated the same actions over generations, not for glory, but for survival. And somehow, in that quiet repetition, they shaped a cultural cornerstone. In the end, one must ask, in a world that moves faster each year, what do we lose when we abandon the slow industries? What wisdom lies in a sheet of paper made not in seconds, but in days measured not by cost, but by care? Perhaps it is in these forgotten crafts that the soul of a people endures, fragile, silent, and enduring as washi itself. Story 2. The endless roads of the Roman postal system. Imagine, if you will, the dry heat of a Roman summer, the sun casting long shadows across white stones etched with cart ruts. The road is silent, save for the rhythmic clatter of hooves and the soft thud of sandals. A courier rides hard, dust trailing behind him like smoke from a distant fire. In his satchel is not gold, not grain, but something far more valuable: information. Welcome to the world of the cursus publicus, the Roman Empire's vast, bureaucratic, and surprisingly efficient postal system. It was not built for love letters or idle gossip, but for control: imperial communication made manifest through a network of relay stations, administrative oversight, and tightly scheduled logistics. While emperors rose and fell, while armies marched and rebellions simmered, the post carried on, mile after mile, day after day, decade after decade. And yet, for all its vital importance, this network is rarely the subject of sweeping narratives. Its function was utilitarian, its servants mostly nameless, but like so many boring things, it held an empire together. The origins of the cursus publicus. The Roman postal system didn't emerge fully formed. In the Republic, messages were often sent via private messengers, slaves, freedmen, or hired couriers. These were unreliable at best, vulnerable to interception, delay, or bribery. But as Rome expanded and the need for governance across vast distances increased, the system had to evolve. Augustus, the first emperor, is credited with formalizing what would become the cursus publicus in the late 1st century BCE. His reforms created a state-run communication network meant to serve the government above all else. Unlike our modern postal services, this system was not open to the public. It was not for merchants, nor ordinary citizens. It was the nervous system of empire, reserved for military orders, tax directives, administrative updates, and decrees from the imperial court. The core of the system was built on roads, Roman roads. These were feats of engineering, laid stone by stone across provinces, straight and enduring, defying the curves of the landscape. And along these roads, at carefully measured intervals, stood the bones of the postal system, the mutations and the mansions. Relay stations and roadside realities. A mutatio was a horse-changing station. Positioned roughly every 8 to 12 Roman miles, about 12-18 km, these were simple facilities where couriers could swap their tired mounts for fresh ones and continue on without delay. Efficiency was key. No long rests, no idle chatter, just saddle up and go. Mansions, spaced farther apart, offered lodging, meals, and limited supplies for officials on sanctioned travel. These were more substantial, often staffed by a small retinue of attendants, cooks, and stable hands. One can imagine the slow pulse of life in a mansio, the morning clang of iron horseshoes, the scent of stale wine and boiled lentils, and the never-ending arrival of messages in sealed packets. To coordinate this, the empire relied on a complex authorization system. Only those with diplomas, official travel permits could access the cursus publicus. These small, inscribed bronze tablets or folded parchments granted passage and use of resources. Without one, the system was closed to you. Even provincial governors had to show documentation if they wanted to requisition animals or sleep in a mansio. The scale of this logistical system was astonishing. Across Europe, North Africa, and the Near East, the Roman roads spanned more than 400,000 kilometers, over 80,000 of them paved. From Londinium to Antioch, from Alexandria to the Danube frontier, the postal network stitched the empire together. And yet it was never fast. Despite its sophistication, communication still took time. A message from Rome to Cologne, for example, might take a week at best. To Jerusalem, perhaps two. Weather, terrain, and unrest could cause delays, and still, compared to the alternatives, this was a miracle of consistency. Bureaucracy, horses, and grain. The cursus publicus was not only about roads and riders, it was a bureaucratic machine fueled by resources. Horses had to be fed, stabled, and trained. Inns required grain, oil, and firewood. Couriers needed equipment and clothing. All of this was managed not by a centralized postmaster, but through layers of provincial officials, supply agents, and tax-supported administrators. In fact, the system often relied on local towns and landowners to provide animals and labor. These were known as vehiculatio obligations, legal duties to supply wagons, oxen, or fodder. Over time, these obligations became increasingly burdensome, particularly in outlying provinces where resources were scarcer. In Gaul and Thrace, petitions survive complaining about the cost of maintaining these duties, especially when used for more than just urgent imperial messages. One curious note: camels were often used in the eastern provinces, particularly in the deserts of Syria and Egypt. This wasn't out of novelty but necessity. The Romans, ever pragmatic, adapted the postal system to fit the land. In mountainous regions, mules or donkeys were preferred. In snow, sleds. Where boats could be used, especially along the Tiber or Nile, river couriers carried messages instead of men. Each province had its own adaptation of the cursus, but the imperial expectation remained the same: continuity, speed, and security. The men who rode. Who were the couriers? For the most part, they were state employees, many of them former soldiers or freedmen tasked with riding hundreds of kilometers a week. They carried messages in satchels, often sealed with wax or cords, and were instructed never to open what they carried. There was little glamour in the work: long hours, poor food, harsh weather. Couriers were rarely celebrated, but they were essential. Without them, the empire might have collapsed under the weight of its own silence. And occasionally, their work intersected with great moments in history. One such example comes from the early 4th century CE, when Constantine the Great, traveling swiftly through Gaul, used the cursus publicus to spread news of his elevation as emperor. His riders, moving quickly, outpaced his rivals and helped him secure loyalty before opposition could form. In times of war or crisis, the cursus was often the first system to be pushed to its limits and sometimes to collapse. An enduring machine. By the late empire, the system was beginning to show signs of strain. Corruption crept in. Officials abused travel permits. Horses were overworked, stations neglected, costs spiraled. Emperors like Diocletian and Constantine issued edicts to reform and regulate the cursus, but the decline was difficult to reverse. As the Western Roman Empire crumbled in the 5th century, so too did its postal system. Roads fell into disrepair. Mutations were abandoned. Messages slowed, then stopped. In some regions, the entire concept of official long-distance communication faded into legend. And yet traces of the cursus publicus remained. In the Eastern Empire Byzantium, the system evolved into the cursus velox and cursus clabularis, serving the same function, albeit in a more limited scope. Echoes of the Roman postal model would reappear in medieval Islamic Barid, in Mongol Yam, and eventually in the royal posts of early modern Europe. But how did such a vast and meticulous system, so bound to a specific moment in history, disappear almost entirely? And what happens to a society when its ability to communicate breaks down, not all at once, but slowly, over generations? You may still be picturing that courier dust-streaked, sunburned, galloping past mile markers etched with the name of an emperor long dead. But now, let us slow down, step back and consider the system from above. A sprawling latticework of movement and message, more quiet than celebrated, more fragile than it seemed. Because the true story of the cursus publicus was not only about horses and roads, but about infrastructure, bureaucracy, and the strain of keeping everything moving. Mapping an empire in motion. The Roman Empire was a marvel of logistics long before the word became common. The famed Itinerarium Antonini, a kind of Roman road map, listed thousands of stations, towns, and distances between them. While not maps in the modern visual sense, these itinerary lists were critical tools for administrators and travelers alike. These lists helped users plot routes, estimate travel time, and locate services. The entire imperial post relied on the assumption that people knew where they were going and how long it should take to get there. Couriers didn't just wander, they moved along well-known segments with precise expectations. To understand how centralized this became, consider that by the 3rd century, the Praetorian prefects, high-ranking imperial officials, had direct oversight of postal operations. They authorized permits, assigned routes, and ensured that communication lines remained open even during times of conflict or civil unrest. Even the emperors themselves relied on these networks. Augustus was known to have couriers dispatched with personal messages to governors and military leaders. Hadrian, that most peripatetic of emperors, crisscrossed the empire in part because the cursus publicus enabled such mobility. His journeys, carved in inscriptions from Britain to Syria, would have been impossible without the infrastructure that supported every hoofbeat and footstep. The diplomatic power of paperwork. One of the more underappreciated components of the Roman postal system was the diploma, the travel warrant issued by the imperial office. These documents were not casual items. Usually written on folded parchment and sealed, they specified the bearer's right to requisition horses, carts, and supplies. Each diploma included the name of the official or courier, the purpose of the journey, the dates for which it was valid, the regions in which it could be used. Forgery was rare but severely punished. Possessing a diploma without authorization could mean imprisonment or worse. The imperial bureaucracy, deeply invested in the efficiency of communication, treated abuse of the system as an offense against the state. The existence of such paperwork reminds us that this was not an informal arrangement, but a regulated system with forms, quotas, and oversight. Every bundle of mail, every change of horse, every rest stop at a mancio was theoretically accounted for. Even the army, a central user of the postal network, had to operate within the permit system. Military couriers could carry codices, folded message tablets between legions, but they still required imperial authorization to use the public system unless traveling under emergency orders. In effect, the cursus publicus was a controlled flow of information carefully monitored, sometimes manipulated, but rarely chaotic. The quiet pressure of maintenance. The grandeur of Roman roads has often been celebrated. All roads lead to Rome. The saying goes, but few dwell on the unending labor required to maintain them. Roads degraded, bridges collapsed, stone markers eroded in storms or were pried up by locals. Mutations and mansions, especially in frontier provinces, required constant upkeep, and that upkeep required people. Typically, the burden of maintaining local infrastructure fell on nearby municipalities. This responsibility was called munera, a system of compulsory civic service that included road repair, grain supply, and postal support. For smaller towns, this was a heavy weight. Maintaining a section of road meant acquiring tools, labor, stone, and timber, all for state use, with little direct return. In Egypt, preserved papyri from the 3rd century CE reveal complaints from village elders who were forced to host imperial messengers for weeks at a time, feeding their horses, providing bedding, repairing carts. Elsewhere, citizens begged for relief from requisition quotas that drained their resources. Though Rome celebrated the reach of its roads, the reality was often more fragile. A rebellion in Gaul, a flood in Hispania, or a winter storm in the Balkans could close a road for weeks. The burden of restoring it fell on locals first, the state second. It is here, perhaps, that the postal system begins to show its seams, not in design, but in sustainability. Letters as power. The messages themselves, the scrolls, tablets, and sealed satchels, are rarely preserved, but their existence changed the very nature of governance. Imagine the effect of a timely letter. A tax order arriving a week early might prevent unrest. A command to withdraw a legion might avoid a massacre. An imperial decree, carried safely across hundreds of kilometers, might reshape a province's law with a single signature. Conversely, a delayed message could mean chaos. There are cases hard to confirm, but haunting, where provinces acted on outdated information. An emperor died, but his death was not yet known in distant lands. Orders were followed for weeks or months under the name of a man already buried. In such moments, the post became not just a conduit of knowledge, but of illusion. Roman historians, from Tacitus to Ammianus Marcellinus, often describe the impact of communication as pivotal. The collapse of cohesion in certain rebellions, like the Gallic Empire of the 3rd century, can partly be attributed to severed or hijacked communications. Control the message, and you control the margins. The decline of an invisible empire. By the 4th and 5th centuries, the Western Roman Empire was stretched thin. The costs of maintaining the cursus publicus rose, even as revenue shrank. Corruption crept in, local officials charging bribes, falsifying documents, or using state horses for private errands. Reforms attempted to curtail abuse. Diocletian tried to tighten administrative control. Constantine further restricted access to travel permits, but these were only temporary salves. In some regions, the stations themselves began to vanish. A mutatio might be abandoned, its roof caved in, its corral empty. Couriers arrived to find no horses, no fodder, no one at all. The flow of messages slowed. As barbarian incursions intensified and provincial authority splintered, the roads became dangerous. Couriers were robbed or killed. Messages never arrived. In effect, silence began to fall across the empire, not all at once, but gradually, like a fog settling over stone. By the late 5th century, in many parts of the West, the postal system had effectively collapsed. Roads remained, but the pulse of communication had stopped, and in that silence, the cohesion of empire eroded. What remained? Despite this decay, some elements endured. In the Byzantine East, the cursus was reformed into a smaller, more centralized system. It lacked the scope of its predecessor, but served imperial needs well into the Middle Ages. Even more enduring was the Roman model of thinking about communication, as something that must be planned, regulated, and protected. Later empires from the Abbasids to the Ottomans, from the Carolingians to the Mongols developed their own courier networks, some of which borrowed directly from Roman principles. And the roads those patient witnesses to history remained. In Britain, in France, in Turkey, modern highways still follow Roman alignments. Beneath tires and trucks lie the echoes of hoofbeats and satchels full of scrolls. But perhaps the most enduring legacy is this idea that the movement of messages is a form of power. Quiet, slow, and largely invisible, yes, but foundational. Because without communication there is no governance, no law, no coordination, no empire. And yet, one cannot help but wonder, what becomes of a civilization when its messages stop moving? What if decline arrives not with war but with silence? You find yourself again on a Roman road. The sun is lower now, the shadows longer. Perhaps the year is 476 CE, perhaps later. The courier does not come this time. The station is quiet. The stone milestone still bearing the name of Emperor Hadrian stands cracked, half buried in weeds. The cursus publicus, once the heartbeat of imperial reach, is now a memory. But that memory is not yet erased. In this final section, we examine the last echoes of Rome's silent postal system, what survived, what collapsed, and what lessons remained, long after the empire's marble faded into dust. The final writers. By the mid-5th century, the Western Roman Empire was no longer a single, cohesive state, but a patchwork of successor kingdoms. Visigoths in Gaul, Vandals in North Africa, Ostrogoths in Italy all carved their own pieces from Rome's body, and with them came the dismemberment of the imperial bureaucracy. The roads were still there, so were the milestones, the bridges, the way stations, but the flow had stopped. Some mutations were repurposed into farms or garrisons, others were looted or left to collapse. The central funding that had maintained them, drawn from taxes, organized by the Praetorian prefects, simply ceased to exist in any meaningful way. A few couriers remained, clinging to their roots in hope or confusion. Others found employment as private messengers or were absorbed into the retinues of local kings. In some places, the cursus sputtered on, maintained by provincial authorities in a reduced form. But increasingly, the flow of imperial messages gave way to local, informal communication networks. The final chapters of the Cursus Publicus were written not in grand reform, but in neglect. It did not die in one moment, but faded like a message carried too slowly, arriving long after it mattered. Byzantium and the inheritance of silence. In the East, the Roman world did not fall, but changed. The Byzantine Empire, seated in Constantinople, preserved many Roman institutions, but not without transformation. The Eastern Cursus Publicus evolved into a more military-oriented communication system, supported by a chain of fortified stations and bolstered by naval messaging when needed. By the 6th century, under Justinian, the postal system had been restructured again, this time focused almost entirely on strategic necessity. In contrast to the earlier imperial vision of unbroken communication across a continent, the Byzantine post was pragmatic, adaptive, and narrower in scope. Yet the idea of central messaging endured. Even in the dark years of plague, war, and iconoclasm, the Byzantine administration used couriers to enforce decrees, spread edicts, and communicate with distant governors. While not as extensive as the Roman model, it reflected the continued belief that without communication, empire was impossible. Byzantium's use of mounted couriers and its preservation of roads in Asia Minor helped inspire later Islamic and Christian postal traditions, proving that even when the stones cracked, the ideas endured. Imitators and innovators. Centuries passed, the Roman Empire became legend, and yet, wherever large states emerged, the need for reliable communication re-emerged as well. In the Islamic Caliphate, the Barid system echoed the Roman design, a chain of relay stations, each supplying fresh mounts, food, and shelter for government couriers. Like the cursus publicus, it required documentation, was state-run, and aimed to unify a sprawling empire through information. Caliphate officials, aware of the Roman example, often used its memory as precedent for their own reforms. In the Mongol Empire, the Yam system emerged, a staggering network of postal stations stretching from China to Eastern Europe. Unlike Rome, the Mongols maintained mobility at an even greater scale. Their horse relays were so efficient that messages could cross continents in days, but the logic was the same: maintain power by maintaining message. Even the medieval Holy Roman Empire made limited attempts to revive state communication lines. However, it wasn't until the early modern period, with the advent of the Habsburgs, the expansion of the French royal post, and the rise of the British General Post Office, that something approaching the efficiency of the cursus publicus was seen again in Europe. Curiously, none of these later systems included the Roman diploma as a core administrative mechanism, yet most retained strict state control. The lesson had been absorbed: information is too valuable to leave unregulated. Legacy in stone and culture. Many Roman roads outlived the empire. They became pilgrimage routes, trade paths, and eventually the skeletons of modern highways. The Via Appia, the Via Augusta, the Ermine Street, they remain, sometimes buried beneath asphalt, sometimes walkable still. Way stations, too, left their marks. Archaeologists have uncovered mansions in Italy, Gaul, and North Africa, their layouts revealing kitchens, stables, and dormitories. Some towns owe their origins to a postal station that, long after the empire's fall, attracted settlers, traders, and eventually became villages. Culturally, the cursus publicus left a quieter legacy. The very idea that government should maintain a communication infrastructure, that citizens can expect a letter to travel from one end of a country to another, is rooted in the Roman precedent. Though most Romans never used the system themselves, the state's ability to function depended on its invisible motion. We take it for granted now. A letter arrives, a message is delivered. But for Rome, it was revolutionary to build an empire not merely on conquest but on continuity. Paperless lessons in modern times. Today, we speak often of communication infrastructure in digital terms: fiber optics, satellite arrays, cloud services. But the principle remains the same. A government, a society, even a family relies on consistent, reliable messaging. And just as in Rome, when that messaging breaks down, so too does unity. The fall of the cursus publicus in the Western Roman Empire did not cause collapse, but it hastened it. When governors could not send for help, when orders arrived too late, when news was distorted or lost, stability withered. There's something poetic about that. The death of empire not with fire or flood, but with silence. The stations fell quiet, the couriers vanished, and in their absence, a whisper of disconnection grew into a roar of chaos. Even now, remnants of that silence remain. In some rural places in Europe and the Middle East, ancient roads still lead nowhere, ghost paths lined with broken stones, once humming with motion. No longer arteries of empire, they are relics of a different kind of power, the power to connect. Final reflection. The Roman postal system was not romantic. It was not glorious. It was not built for the people. It was built for control, administrative, imperial, bureaucratic. And yet, in that quiet efficiency, in the slow thud of horses and the rustle of parchment, there is something enduring. Perhaps the real legacy of the cursus publicus is this: that the threads of civilization are not woven by kings or armies, but by messengers moving without fanfare, carrying the weight of continuity. In a world obsessed with the spectacular, we might do well to remember the boring greatness of the post. So the next time you send a letter, receive a delivery, or even tap out a message into the void, pause for a moment. Somewhere beneath your fingertips lies a road, 2,000 years old, lined with stone and silence. And you might wonder, when did we stop noticing the roads that carry our thoughts? Story 3, Salt and Silence, the forgotten monopolies of imperial China. Salt. To you, it might seem mundane, something shaken on a meal, sitting quietly in a kitchen cupboard. But in ancient China, salt was a matter of empire. It was not only a staple of life and diet, but also a silent pillar of state finance, regional control, and bureaucratic innovation. While dynasties rose and fell with dramatic warfare and sweeping reforms, the salt monopoly endured, steadily collecting, distributing, and funding. In this first section, we'll uncover the early origins and structure of this silent but powerful monopoly, exploring how something as ordinary as salt became a tool of imperial governance that lasted for more than 2,000 years. The lifeblood of the state. Long before the Han Dynasty unified much of East Asia under imperial rule, Chinese states had already begun managing salt as a strategic resource. By the time of the Warring States period, 5th-3rd centuries BCE, rulers understood that controlling salt meant controlling people. Unlike grain, which could be grown by individual families, salt required specialized production techniques: boiling brine, harvesting sea salt, mining rock salt, and access to specific natural deposits. Salt could not be substituted. Everyone needed it. The average farmer or peasant might go without silk or bronze, but not without salt. Livestock required it. Pickling, the primary method of food preservation, relied on it. In a hot summer, salt was even used to prevent heatstroke in laborers and soldiers. So, when the first emperors of unified China looked for reliable ways to fund their bureaucracy and military campaigns, they turned not to conquest alone, but to control of salt. The Han Blueprint, monetizing the mundane. It was during the Western Han Dynasty, 206 BCE, 9 CE, that the salt monopoly became institutionalized. Chancellor Sang Hengyang, a brilliant and calculating economist under Emperor Wu, proposed a state-controlled monopoly on both iron and salt, two necessities of life and war. His reasoning was simple. Rather than impose heavier taxes on peasants who had little surplus income, why not extract wealth from commodities everyone used? The state would license producers, set prices, and control distribution. Private salt production was outlawed or heavily restricted. The system worked. Salt revenues poured into the imperial treasury, helping fund campaigns against the Xiongnu nomads and building the infrastructure of empire: roads, granaries, border fortifications. The salt monopoly became a core financial strategy that outlived Sang Hengyang himself. Even when the policy was occasionally repealed in later dynasties, it was always reinstated. The logic was too powerful. Still, the production of salt was no small task. Unlike silver or silk, it wasn't hidden away in a vault or worn by the elite. It was harvested, refined, and carried by the ton across rivers, mountains, and plains. Methods of production. China's geography offered several major sources of salt. See salt in coastal regions, such as Shandong and Fujian. Salt was produced by evaporating seawater in shallow pans. This required careful climate management and was highly seasonal. Entire communities along the coast were organized around this work. Salt wells and brine springs. In Sichuan and parts of the interior, underground brine was tapped using bamboo drilling methods. The extracted brine was boiled in large iron pans, often over wood fires. The scale of these operations could be enormous. Some salt wells were more than 100 meters deep. Rock salt mining, less common, but present in some northern regions. Salt was mined directly from underground deposits. These production methods were labor-intensive and dangerous. Salt well workers risked collapse, fire, or scalding burns from boiling brine. Still, the work was steady and, for many, one of the few available jobs. Control of these sites was absolute. Government agents or state-sanctioned producers oversaw operations. Unauthorized extraction could be met with severe punishment, including forced labor or execution. Salt police patrolled production areas, inspecting records and sealing shipments. The salt gabelle and regional monopolies. The term gabelle, used in Europe to describe a tax on salt, applies just as well to China, though the system was far older. The Chinese salt tax was not just a price markup. It was a comprehensive mechanism involving production quotas, licensed transport, designated sales agents, and fixed prices. In many dynasties, the country was divided into salt districts, each with its own administrative structure. These districts regulated how much salt could be produced, who could sell it, where it could be transported, what price it must be sold at. Transport routes were tightly monitored. Couriers and boats carrying salt required official documents, known as yinpiao, salt certificates. These slips of paper were a kind of precursor to modern logistics tracking. They listed the origin, quantity, and destination of a shipment. Merchants without proper documents risked seizure of goods or worse. The profits from these sales went primarily to the state. In the Tang dynasty, 7th-10th centuries, for instance, salt revenue reportedly accounted for over half of the government's income at certain points. This wasn't a minor enterprise, it was a central pillar of the imperial economy. Salt merchants, power in the shadows. Though the government controlled production, merchants were the middlemen of the system. Licensed salt merchants were among the wealthiest individuals in imperial China. They were allowed to purchase bulk salt from government depots and resell it at controlled prices. Some amassed enough fortune to rival the landed aristocracy. Still, their position was precarious. Merchants were viewed with suspicion by Confucian scholars and bureaucrats, considered necessary but morally dubious. They could be elevated to wealth and influence or crushed under the weight of shifting policy. In the Ming Dynasty, 14th-17th centuries, the government began offering salt sale rights in exchange for grain transport services. Merchants who delivered grain to famine-stricken regions or frontier garrisons were paid not in silver, but with yin salt tickets, allowing them to legally sell salt at a profit. This barter-like policy created a strange fusion of logistics, taxation, and commerce, one of the most complex systems of its time. And yet, for all the layers of bureaucracy and market manipulation, the end result was the same. Salt moved, profits flowed, and the empire held together. Corruption and consequences. No monopoly is immune to corruption, and the salt monopoly was no exception. Smuggling was endemic. In the Song dynasty, entire black market networks operated in coastal provinces, producing and selling illicit salt. The penalties were harsh, but the rewards greater. Inspectors tasked with enforcing laws were often bribed or became complicit. In times of famine or unrest, local officials would turn a blind eye to illegal salt sales in order to preserve social stability. The state walked a fine line. Too strict and rebellion brewed, too lax and revenues collapsed. Salt riots were not uncommon. When prices spiked due to shortages or overtaxation, urban and rural communities alike erupted. One notable example occurred during the Yuan dynasty, when excessive levies caused widespread anger in the lower Yangtze region. These were not protests over ideology, they were about survival. Bureaucracy and brine. In many ways, the salt monopoly was a mirror of Chinese imperial administration at large. It combined centralized planning, regional variation, moral tension between state goals and private profit, constant documentation and inspection. It was, in essence, boring but essential. An entire class of officials rose through the salt administration. They didn't command armies or write poetry. They managed ledgers, tracked shipments, inspected brine pans, and balanced budgets. And yet, their work held up the very structure of the state. Salt was so integral that the famous Qing dynasty statesman Li Hongzheng once remarked, The salt tax is the sinew of the treasury. Without it, civil service salaries, military upkeep, and disaster relief could falter. But one must ask, how did a system so vital, so carefully managed, begin to fray? What happens when outside powers, internal decay, and changing technology undermine an institution that has lasted 2 millennia? We return now to the brine pits of the empire, not during the quiet efficiency of the Han or Tang, but in an age of anxiety. The Qing dynasty, China's last imperial house, is well into its reign. The 18th century has brought prosperity to some, but also an ominous accumulation of pressures: population growth, administrative fatigue, and foreign encroachment. At the heart of it all, still sustaining the great wheels of government, is salt. But the monopoly, once a symbol of bureaucratic mastery, is showing its cracks. This section explores the slow unraveling of China's salt system, the efforts to reform it, and the quiet wars fought not on battlefields, but in ledgers and shipping manifests. A machine under pressure. By the time the Qing dynasty reached its height in the early 1700s, the salt monopoly was already groaning under its own weight. Population had boomed to over 300 million people, increasing demand for salt exponentially. But supply chains had not kept pace. Transport routes, still dependent on rivers, canals, and aging infrastructure, were increasingly unreliable. The Grand Canal, once the lifeline of China's inland commerce, had begun to silt up. Floods and droughts destabilized regions dependent on predictable salt deliveries. Local shortages were becoming more common. And still, the state relied on the salt tax for revenue. Officials in the Ministry of Revenue and the Salt Administration, a powerful bureau unto itself, struggled to enforce pricing, quotas, and licensing. Worse, the sale rights system introduced during the Ming, offering salt licenses in exchange for services, had mutated into a deeply corrupt institution. Merchants hoarded licenses, formed cartels, and bribed officials to underreport profits. Some licenses were resold dozens of times before a single grain of salt reached the market. Ghost accounts, fictitious shipments entered into ledgers, proliferated. And as always, when bureaucracy strains, a black market blossoms. Salt smugglers and shadow networks. By the mid-Qing period, vast illegal salt operations had developed in nearly every coastal province, particularly in Zhejiang, Fujian, and Guangdong. These were not isolated acts of theft, but organized, systematic alternatives to the state monopoly. Entire communities produced and moved salt without official oversight. Smugglers used small coastal vessels, river barges, and hidden footpaths to transport salt inland. Some employed lookouts, messengers, and even coded signals to avoid government patrols. The smugglers were not always impoverished peasants. Many were former officials, dismissed merchants, or corrupt middlemen who had lost favor in the official system. They operated with impunity in some areas, so much so that they were more reliable providers than the legal supply chain. Punishments were severe: branding, exile, execution, but enforcement was inconsistent. In times of famine or unrest, even upright magistrates hesitated to crack down. Better to tolerate smuggling than provoke riots. In some regions, the local gentry openly petitioned for lighter regulation, arguing that black market salt was the only affordable option for the poor. The monopoly had become not only inefficient, but resented. Voices for reform. A few visionary officials recognized the problem and tried to reform it. Among them was Tao Zhu, Chinese letter, a Qing statesman active in the 1830s. Appointed to oversee the Salt Bureau in Lianghui, the region controlling salt for the lower Yangtze, Tao was appalled by what he saw. Corruption, he noted, was not simply moral failure, it was a system. Officials padded expenses, merchants bought licenses with grain they never delivered, and salt was resold at prices far beyond the reach of commoners. Tao Zhu's response was both bold and pragmatic. He abolished hereditary salt-selling rights, opened salt sales to open bidding, reducing elite merchant control, standardized prices, and simplified documentation, cracked down on local corruption, removing dozens of minor officials. His reforms were wildly successful temporarily. Salt prices dropped, availability increased, and the Treasury saw improved returns. But resistance was fierce. The old merchant class lobbied court allies. Bureaucrats resented the exposure of their inefficiencies. When Tao was transferred out, many reforms were reversed or quietly undermined. Other officials, inspired by Tao's vision, attempted similar changes in different regions, but few had the clout or independence to resist institutional inertia. The salt monopoly remained, bloated and brittle. Salt and foreign intrusion. As the 19th century progressed, the Qing Empire faced an entirely new challenge: Western imperialism. The Opium Wars 1839–1842 and 1856–1860, triggered in part by trade imbalances and British desires to sell opium in Chinese markets, devastated Qing control. One little-known consequence of these wars was the partial foreignization of Chinese tax collection. In the Treaty of Tientsin, 1858, the Qing agreed to allow foreign inspectors to oversee maritime customs duties, a humiliating concession that bled into other fiscal sectors. Eventually, the Salt Inspectorate, a foreign supervised bureau, was established with the goal of reforming and modernizing the collection of salt taxes. Staffed by a mix of Chinese and foreign officials, including British customs officers, it imposed new standards of auditing, distribution, and oversight. In some ways, the inspectorate was effective. It reduced corruption in ports, improved coastal logistics, and provided the Qing court with crucial income during times of crisis. But symbolically, it was devastating. The salt monopoly, once a proud pillar of imperial governance, had become so compromised that the court outsourced part of its operation to foreign hands. The irony was sharp. A system created to unify the empire under central control was now a tool partially governed by outsiders. Bureaucracy in the late Qing collapsed from within. By the late 1800s, the salt monopoly was failing both practically and ideologically. Rural communities no longer respected it. Smugglers often operated with open local support. Foreign treaties constrained how much reform was possible, and the court itself, fragmented by internal rivalries and conservative backlash, lacked the unity to overhaul the system. The dynasty's waning years were filled with urgent crises: Taiping Rebellion, Boxer Rebellion, foreign spheres of influence, and a crumbling fiscal foundation. Yet salt remained essential. In fact, in the 1890s, over 20% of all Qing revenue still came from the salt tax. It was a paradox. The state depended on a system that it could no longer fully control. And so the salt monopoly limped on, neither reformed nor abandoned, a relic too large to discard, too broken to fix. A glimpse of what was to come. By the early 20th century, with revolution on the horizon, reformers and scholars increasingly called for full liberalization of the salt trade. The monopoly, they argued, hindered economic growth, burdened the poor, and enriched a corrupt class of middlemen. And yet, no one could quite envision how to replace it. Because beneath the layers of inefficiency and inequity, the salt monopoly had done something extraordinary. It had functioned for over 2,000 years as a direct link between the state and the people. It was infrastructure. It was bureaucracy. It was the quiet machinery of rule. But it could not survive the modern world. Steamships, railways, modern taxation systems, foreign treaties all undermined the logic of monopolized salt. So as the Qing began to collapse and the Republic of China emerged in 1912, The salt monopoly stood as one of the final, flickering lights of the old order. Still functioning, still taxing, but only just. And so we must ask, when a system survives not because it works, but because there is no alternative, what does that say about the nature of power? And how do the quiet failures of bureaucracy shape the fate of empires? The Qing Empire has fallen. The dragon banners are lowered. A new republic declares itself, chaotic and unsure, but the salt still flows. This is the final phase of the story, a story not of triumph or sudden collapse, but of erosion. The salt monopoly, for over 2,000 years a core mechanism of Chinese statecraft, does not vanish overnight. It lingers. It is absorbed. It is reformed. And in time it becomes a ghost of itself, still shaping policy, still echoing in bureaucracy, even in the 20th century. Now we explore how this ancient institution stumbled through modernity, stumbled into foreign control, and was eventually dissolved not with rebellion or decree, but with the silent triumph of a new economic logic. Salt in the Republican era, between legacy and necessity. After the Qing dynasty collapsed in 1912, the newly formed Republic of China faced an enormous dilemma. How to fund a modern state with no stable taxation system, no unified government, and a war-torn landscape? The answer, at least temporarily, was salt. Despite its imperial origins, the salt monopoly was retained almost immediately by the Republican authorities. It was one of the few functioning mechanisms capable of collecting consistent revenue. Salt inspectors and bureaucrats, many of them holdovers from the Qing administration, simply continued their work now under the banner of the Republic. But the reality on the ground was messy. China had fragmented into a patchwork of warlord fiefdoms, each with its own armies, currencies, and taxation policies. In many regions, salt was taxed multiple times by competing authorities. Transport routes were harassed by bandits or seized by rival factions. Smuggling exploded. To survive, the central government in Beijing leaned even more heavily on the foreign-managed salt inspectorate, which had been expanded during the Qing's final decades. This inspectorate now played a bizarre role. It served as a relatively honest and functional branch of governance in a country with little else resembling national order. Under its oversight, salt tax revenues were collected with reasonable consistency. Foreign loans to the Republic, especially from Britain and France, were secured by promising repayment through salt tax revenues. Inspectors published detailed reports, introduced modern auditing, and attempted to standardize pricing across regions. This odd entanglement, an ancient Chinese institution managed by British customs officers and used to fund Chinese warlords, was emblematic of China's early 20th century condition. A modern state in name, a fractured state in function, and an imperial state in economic structure. Chiang Kai-shek and the nationalist salt reforms. By the late 1920s, the Nationalist Party, Kuomintang, led by Chiang Kai-shek, had begun to consolidate power. In 1928, they recaptured Beijing and formally unified large portions of China under a single regime. As part of their drive toward modernization, they launched ambitious efforts to reform the tax system, and salt was at the center of it. Chiang saw the salt monopoly as both a critical revenue source and a symbol of national humiliation. That such a vital resource was still under partial foreign oversight infuriated nationalist sentiment. Under new policies, the Salt Inspectorate was nationalized, though many foreign staff remained. State monopolies were reasserted in key provinces, though enforcement remained uneven. Smuggling was declared a national threat. Public propaganda emphasized salt as a patriotic product. And yet, even as Chiang sought to reclaim control, he could not do away with the monopoly. The state still needed the income. The army, bloated and expensive, depended in part on salt tax revenues. The bureaucracy, though weakened, still leaned on inherited institutions. Attempts were made to streamline distribution, digitize records where possible, and break up merchant cartels. In some regions, reform worked. In others, it was undermined by local corruption or warlord resistance. Then came the Second Sino-Japanese War. War and the breaking point. From 1937 to 1945, Japan invaded and occupied large portions of China, including many key salt-producing regions. The monopoly, already fragile, shattered under the weight of war. The Japanese puppet governments established their own salt monopolies. Nationalist forces, now based in Chongqing, attempted to maintain control over interior salt fields. Communist guerrillas in the north created parallel systems to produce and sell salt in controlled zones. The salt monopoly became a military asset, a weapon of survival, and a propaganda tool. In many regions, salt tax records were no longer kept. Payments were made in kind. Transportation became dangerous, if not impossible. The very idea of centralized salt control, already centuries old, began to dissolve under the heat of modern warfare. By the time the war ended in 1945, the monopoly existed mostly in name. The Communist Era, Revolution and Dissolution. When the Chinese Communist Party seized power in 1949, it faced the same question every regime since the Han had confronted: how to fund the state. The answer again was salt. In the early years of the People's Republic of China, the salt monopoly was retained and placed under the Ministry of Light Industry. It was reorganized into state-run enterprises, with production, pricing, and distribution managed through 5-year plans. But there was a difference. The communists did not see salt as a revenue stream, they saw it as a public utility. Prices were fixed low. Smuggling declined sharply, as salt was now accessible and state-enforced. For the first time in Chinese history, the monopoly became genuinely universal and affordable. Still, its administrative skeleton was largely inherited from the Qing and Republican periods. Many of the same regional divisions remained. The archives of the Salt Administration continued to be referenced. The Chinese government even issued public reminders that salt should not be wasted, not because of tax loss, but because it was a precious shared resource. Then, in 2017, after over 2,000 years, China formally abolished the salt monopoly. Private companies were permitted to produce and sell salt. Pricing controls were lifted. The Salt Bureau, one of the oldest continuous bureaucracies in human history, was dissolved. There was no parade, no headlines, just a quiet policy change, one final ledger entry in the longest-running commercial institution the world has ever known. The ghost in the pantry. Salt remains a staple of life. It seasons food, it preserves, it sustains. But in China, it also whispers. Every grain is a reminder of a long, slow story, one told not in battles or declarations, but in receipts, brine, inspections, and quotas. For over 2,000 years, salt was the silent currency of statecraft, the invisible burden of governance, the quiet industry that built roads, paid soldiers, and fed court officials. Today, you can buy a packet of salt in Beijing or Guangzhou for a few yuan. It arrives without fanfare. But its ancestors were escorted by boat, taxed by dynasty, inspected by imperial agents, and tracked on bamboo slips. And so we ask, what happens to the soul of a civilization when its longest institution disappears not through collapse, but by slow irrelevance? Does a nation change when the last salt inspector hangs up his uniform? Or has the monopoly simply shifted forms, its silence absorbed into newer systems, newer controls? Story 4. The Calendar Keepers of Medieval Monasteries. Close your eyes and imagine the hush of a stone cloister in northern Europe. It is the 9th century. A thin fog drapes over the monastery grounds. Inside, the smell of beeswax mingles with cold stone. The soft scrape of quills on vellum echoes faintly through the scriptorium. But this is not a tale of illuminated manuscripts or saintly devotion. This is the story of calendars and the men who spent their lives measuring time, one liturgical season at a time. In an age where clocks were rare and inconsistent, when most people counted days by sunrise and harvest, the monks of medieval Europe developed and preserved a way of thinking about time that shaped everything: prayer, politics, agriculture, and even empire. Their labor was slow, precise, and largely invisible, but without them, the modern calendar might not exist. Let us now enter the quiet world of the calendar keepers. The monastic inheritance of time. The medieval calendar did not spring from nothing. It was the product of inheritance, first from the Roman world, and then from early Christian adaptation. The Julian calendar, introduced by Julius Caesar in 46 BCE, still governed the passage of months and years in Europe by the time the early monasteries were formed. But while the structure was Roman, the rhythm was Christian. After Constantine's conversion and the rise of Christianity, time itself was increasingly measured in relation to the life of Christ and the seasons of the Church. Monks in the early Middle Ages, particularly in Ireland, Gaul, and Anglo-Saxon England, took it upon themselves to formalize this rhythm. They created liturgical calendars, tracking not just days and months, but also feast days, fasts, saints, commemorations, and lunar cycles essential to calculating Easter. This was no simple task. Without printed materials or centralized charts, monks had to compute dates manually using tables, cycles, and increasingly complex computus, timekeeping mathematics. The problem of Easter. Of all the dates in the Christian year, Easter was the most contentious. Why? Because it is a movable feast, its date shifts each year, dependent on the full moon following the vernal equinox. Calculating it accurately required knowing the date of the equinox, tracking the lunar cycle, reconciling discrepancies between the solar year and the 354-day lunar year. Early medieval monks studied Paschal table schedules projecting Easter dates across decades or centuries. These tables relied on the 19-year Metonic cycle, which attempted to align solar and lunar calendars. But even this was imperfect. Monasteries across Europe frequently disagreed on the correct Easter. In Ireland and parts of Britain, one system prevailed. In Rome, another. The result was ecclesiastical confusion, Christian communities celebrating the resurrection on different days. Monks debated it in letters and councils. Some spent years refining their tables. Others wrote tracts defending their method as theologically superior. To us, it may seem trivial. To them, it was doctrine, order, and obedience to God's time. The labor of computation. Who were these calendar keepers? They were not necessarily famous theologians or abbots, but rather scribes and scholars trained in computistics, the science of timekeeping in the medieval church. These men spent their days copying astronomical tables by hand, calculating leap years, adjusting feast day cycles, tracking the progression of saints, days, harvest festivals, and ember days, quarterly periods of fasting and prayer. They did all this without mechanical clocks. Instead, they relied on solar observations, lunar phases, and canonical hours divisions of the day set for prayer. Matins, lauds, prime, terce, sext, none, vespers, and compline. Time was spiritual, not secular. To mark the wrong hour was not merely a mistake, it was to fall out of rhythm with God. In monasteries such as Cluny, St. Gall, or Whitby, calendar keeping became a respected but quiet art. Tables were carefully bound in parchment. Corrections were made in marginalia. Some scribes used color-coding red ink for feast days, black for ordinary time, gold for major festivals. These were the origins of the red-letter day. Calendars as agricultural tools. Outside the cloister walls, peasants marked time by weather, sowing, and harvest. But monks also played a role in transmitting timekeeping knowledge to rural communities. Monastic calendars often included agricultural almanacs, simple notes like, "Sow barley the week after St. Cuthbert's Day. If the moon is full on St. Michael's, expect early frost. Shear sheep after the second Sunday of Pentecost." These weren't superstitions. They were empirical observations passed through generations of monks, sometimes written in the margins of psalters or breviaries. The church's liturgical calendar thus became the rural clock. Harvest festivals aligned with saints' days. Plowing and planting followed feast cycles. Time, sanctified in monasteries, was measured in wheat and lambing as much as in candles and chants. The scriptorium and the scroll. The physical work of creating calendars took place mostly in the scriptorium, the monastery's writing room. Here, monks worked hunched over wooden desks, copying tables, drawing solar diagrams, and writing glosses explaining the finer points of computus. No page was printed. Every chart, every number, every decorative initial was created by hand. Mistakes had consequences. A miscalculated Easter could ripple through an entire year's worship schedule. A missing saint's feast might be seen as neglecting the heavenly court. Monks proofread obsessively, sometimes arguing over tables for months. Some monasteries specialized in calendar work. The Venerable Bede, an Anglo-Saxon monk of the 8th century, wrote extensively on timekeeping. His De Temporum Ration, The Reckoning of Time, became a standard text across Europe, blending theology, astronomy, and mathematics. Bede taught that understanding time was a way of understanding creation itself, a divine order waiting to be discovered through quiet labor. Sounding the hours. Even beyond writing, monks lived by the calendar. Their days were governed by the rule of Saint Benedict, which mandated specific prayers at specific times. But how were these times marked? Before mechanical clocks, monasteries used water clocks, clepsydra, sundials placed on cloister walls, sand timers, particularly for shorter durations, bell towers rung at set intervals. The ringing of bells was itself an act of computation. A designated monk, often the sacristan, would estimate time by shadow, weather, or experience and ring the bell accordingly. His accuracy was not perfect, but it was consistent, which was often more important. In this way, the monastic bell became one of the earliest time-regulating technologies in Europe. Outside the cloister, villagers would also hear these bells. The tolling of vespers or compline often became the signal to end work, close markets, or begin fasts. Thus, the monastic calendar was not only preserved but broadcast across the countryside. Time as theology. Perhaps most remarkably, monks did not see time as neutral. Time was sacred. Time was creation, rhythm, repetition. The calendar was not just a schedule, it was a map of salvation. Each day commemorated something: a saint, a martyr, a miracle, a fast, a feast. The liturgical year, cycling through Advent, Lent, Easter, Pentecost, and ordinary time, told the story of Christ's life in perpetual rotation. To keep the calendar was to participate in eternity. And yet, with all this labor, tables copied, feast days tracked, errors corrected, one question lingered for centuries. Was the calendar even accurate? For while the monks of medieval Europe tracked time with diligence and care, they could not stop the slow drift of the Julian calendar. Over the centuries, it fell behind the solar year by minutes, then hours, then days. By the 16th century, the calendar was nearly 10 days off. But who would correct it, and how? The monastery bell tolls, the candle is trimmed, and the monk bows his head to begin vespers. But outside the cloister, the stars are not where they once were, at least not according to the ancient calendar. It is still March, but spring feels off. The equinox comes earlier than expected. The sun no longer aligns with the calendar's predictions. This was the quiet but growing problem facing the church in the late medieval period. Despite centuries of faithful calendar keeping, of scribes copying tables and calculating lunar cycles, something had begun to slip. This section will explore the long, slow realization that the calendar was broken, how monks noticed it, how reformers tried to fix it, and how this invisible discrepancy would ultimately ignite a crisis that stretched from cloisters to cathedrals, and eventually to the Pope himself. The Julian drift. The problem lay not in laziness or ignorance, but in astronomy. The Julian calendar, introduced by Julius Caesar in 46 BCE, assumed the solar year to be 365.25 days long. This is very close, but slightly off. The actual solar year is approximately 365.2422 days. That's a difference of about 11 minutes per year. Tiny, yes, but over centuries those minutes added up. By the 13th century, the vernal equinox, which was supposed to occur around March 21, had drifted back to March 12. That may seem like a minor mismatch, but it had enormous consequences, especially for calculating Easter, which was determined by the lunar cycle following the equinox. This drift didn't go unnoticed. Monks, particularly those trained in computers, began noticing the misalignment. Spring festivals arrived before the true equinox. Saints' days felt dislocated from the seasons. The calendar was not matching the world. But correcting it was not simple. The Julian calendar had been in use for over 1,500 years. Every feast day, every legal document, every liturgical cycle depended on it. To change the calendar was to change everything. Quiet attempts at reform. Before the eventual Gregorian reform, numerous thinkers proposed adjustments. One of the earliest was Robert Grosseteste, a 13th-century English bishop and scholar. In his astronomical treatises, he noted the Julian discrepancy and warned of compounding errors. His proposals were cautious, small adjustments, alternate leap year cycles, but nothing came of them. The church was wary of changing something so embedded. Later in the 14th century, Nicole Orsmy, a French philosopher, proposed adding leap year corrections to reduce the drift. Again, his ideas were noted but shelved. Why so much hesitation? Because the calendar wasn't just a practical tool, it was sacred. To imply that Easter might be celebrated on the wrong day felt dangerous, even heretical. And then there were legal concerns. Land grants, charters, ecclesiastical privileges all referenced fixed dates. Altering those would spark administrative chaos. Instead, monks tried to work around the problem. Many monasteries kept private tables adjusting Easter calculations for their own local use. Some scriptoriums began copying annotations into liturgical texts. Easter earlier than expected this year, or Feast of St. Benedict now outside Lent. These were quiet rebellions not of doctrine, but of data. The council that never was. In the 15th century, the calendar debate reached higher levels. Church authorities began to consider formal reform. The Council of Constance, 1414–1418, which sought to resolve the Western Schism, briefly discussed calendar issues but quickly tabled them amid more pressing concerns, like resolving which pope was legitimate. Later, the Council of Basel, 1430–1449, gave serious thought to revising the calendar and even commissioned studies. Astronomers and clerics collaborated on reform proposals. But again, nothing happened. Political instability, wars, and the looming shadow of Protestant criticism made church officials wary of altering something as foundational as time itself. Reform was always just over the horizon. Life inside the drift. Meanwhile, life inside the monasteries carried on. Despite the growing inaccuracy of the Julian calendar, monks continued to mark the canonical hours with remarkable precision. Mechanical clocks had begun to appear in some monasteries. By the 14th century, primitive, gear-driven devices that rang bells at set intervals. Some clock towers, like those in Salisbury, Strasbourg, and York, became marvels of engineering, complete with moving figurines, astrological dials, and liturgical automata. Yet even these were tethered to the flawed Julian year. Monks would adjust the clocks based on observed sunrise and sunset. They knew the calendar was imperfect, but they also knew the rhythm of prayer mattered more than the mathematics. In private notes, computists acknowledged the drift, but they did not panic. Time, after all, belonged to God. Their task was to interpret, not to correct. The age of observatories. By the 16th century, the humanist and scientific awakening brought new tools to the calendar problem: astronomical observatories. Jesuit scholars, often trained in both theology and mathematics, built observatories in Rome, Bologna, and Lisbon. They charted the stars, measured solstices, and plotted lunar phases with unprecedented accuracy. The data confirmed what monks had long suspected: the equinox was drifting by nearly a day every 130 years. Easter had been celebrated on the wrong date for more than a century. This new generation of scholars had both the tools and the intellectual courage to propose a bold solution: the Pope's calendar. Finally, in 1582, Pope Gregory XIII, advised by Jesuit astronomers like Christopher Clavius, promulgated the Gregorian calendar. The reform involved skipping 10 days. Thursday, October 4, 1582, was followed by Friday, October 15. Revising leap year rules. Years divisible by 100 would not be leap years unless also divisible by 400. Establishing new Easter calculation tables based on improved astronomical models. Catholic countries like Spain, Portugal, and Italy adopted the new calendar immediately. Protestant regions resisted seeing it as a papal intrusion. England, for instance, would not switch until 1752. In monasteries, the change was monumental. Scribes rewrote computist manuals. Feast day calendars were updated. Mechanical clocks had to be recalibrated. Some saints' days moved. A few were quietly dropped. But for the monks who had tracked the sky for centuries, the reform was also a kind of vindication. The drift had been real. The calculations had not been in vain. Time, however slowly, could be corrected. Echoes in silence. Even after the reform, the tradition of monastic calendar keeping continued. Monasteries continued to publish breviaries, missals, and tables. Some monks began to track not only religious feasts, but also solar eclipses, tides, and planetary motions. They became early naturalists, documenting the rhythms of the world. In the 18th and 19th centuries, as scientific timekeeping shifted to universities and observatories, monks quietly ceded their role, but their legacy remained. Many of the saints' days and liturgical seasons still observed in Christianity today were shaped in scriptorium centuries earlier. Even the structure of our calendar, its leap years, its equinoxes, its divisions of sacred and ordinary time, carries the imprint of Benedictine hours and Paschal tables. And though few now hear it, the monastery bell still tolls, marking time not in minutes, but in prayer. But how does the story of sacred timekeeping connect to the invention of secular time? When does the calendar, once a spiritual map, become a tool for commerce, taxation, and empire? The candle burns low. The bell tolls none. Another monastic day draws to its quiet conclusion. But outside the cloister, the world is changing. Cities are growing. Merchants are tallying accounts. Kings are planning wars and taxes. And slowly, imperceptibly, time begins to shift from a sacred rhythm of chants and feasts to a measured framework of work, profit, and control. This final section traces the transition from the monastery's quiet calendar to the clock face of modernity, how time, once kept in silence and sanctity, was appropriated by kingdoms, merchants, and eventually machines. It is a story not of sudden change, but of quiet appropriation. And at its heart lies one persistent question: when did we stop hearing the bells? Monks as custodians of time. Throughout the Middle Ages, monastic communities were the guardians of temporal structure. They maintained calendars, adjusted feast days, and served as the de facto timekeepers for entire regions. Villages without clocks often synchronized daily life to the distant toll of monastic bells. In many parts of Europe, these religious houses were the only institutions with accurate knowledge of astronomical cycles, historical records of harvest patterns, weather changes, and eclipses, copyists capable of preserving and transmitting Computus manuals and chronologies. But by the 14th century, two developments began to chip away at monastic dominance over time: the rise of urban commercial centers, the invention of mechanical timekeeping, the merchant's clock. As trade flourished and cities expanded, time began to serve new purposes. Guilds, market stalls, and town councils needed a shared and standard measure of hours. Prayer bells were no longer sufficient. Precision mattered. In Italian cities like Milan, Padua, and Florence, public clocks were erected on towers not to mark matins or vespers, but to regulate commerce. Bells rang not for prayer, but to open and close city gates, enforce curfews, and schedule court proceedings. These early clocks were mechanical marvels driven by weights and gears, not shadows or water. By the 15th century, their proliferation across Europe had changed the perception of time itself. Monks continued to ring the canonical hours, but increasingly, the world around them was ticking to another rhythm: the merchant's hour, the contract's deadline, the military campaign's schedule. A shift was underway from qualitative time, rooted in religious meaning, to quantitative time, measured in hours and minutes. Calendars as instruments of the state. As secular rulers grew more powerful, they began to see timekeeping as a tool of administration. In the 15th and 16th centuries, monarchs and city governments published official calendars with tax deadlines, feast exemptions, and market schedules, enforced standardized dating systems for legal documents and contracts, aligned regional observances with royal policy, sometimes suppressing local saint days deemed superstitious. In Protestant regions, the liturgical calendar was deliberately dismantled, feasts replaced with civic observances, saints' days replaced with moral instruction. Luther himself retained only a few key Christian feasts in the Lutheran calendar. Time was declericalized, simplified. Even in Catholic countries, the Jesuits, originally defenders of Gregorian reform, eventually turned calendar mastery into a colonial project. Missionary calendars and imperial time. One of the least remembered legacies of monastic computistics is its role in globalization. When Jesuit missionaries traveled to China, India, and South America, they brought more than the gospel. They brought astronomical charts, eclipse predictions, Gregorian calendar reformations. In Beijing, Jesuit astronomers were employed at the imperial court to correct the Chinese calendar, improving predictions for lunar eclipses and solstices. The Kangxi Emperor himself praised Jesuit methods, even as he remained skeptical of their theology. Thus, in a strange twist, the techniques developed by medieval monks honed in candlelit cloisters became instruments of imperial diplomacy. Time was no longer only for salvation, it was for sovereignty. The quiet end of liturgical time. By the 18th century, few monasteries retained the full complexity of computistical scholarship. Timekeeping had been outsourced. Academies and observatories calculated equinoxes and leap years. Governments determined fiscal calendars. Publishers distributed almanacs with secularized feast days. The liturgical year still marked Christian life: Christmas, Lent, Easter, but the social and political dominance of sacred time was waning. Farmers followed planting calendars, not feast calendars. Schools followed terms, not seasons. In monasteries, the canonical hours continued, but increasingly as internal disciplines, not community signals. Few villagers now listened for compline. Town clocks had replaced abbey bells. Even monastic silence was being timed: prayers measured in hours, retreats scheduled in blocks. Time had become management, not meditation. Legacy in language and culture. And yet traces remain. We still use terms like calendar, from kalendi, the Roman word for the first day of the month. Red letter day, from monastic feasts written in red ink. Noon, from nane hora, the ninth hour, roughly 3 p.m. in Roman time, which shifted over centuries to 12 p.m. Holiday, from holy day, once marked in the monastic calendar. Even the 7-day week, tied loosely to biblical tradition, and the lunar phases, endures primarily because of monastic and ecclesiastical insistence over centuries. These relics of monastic timekeeping surround us: quiet, unobtrusive, forgotten. Reflections on forgotten clocks. The monastery bell once ruled the day. Its toll was law, prayer, rhythm, order. Now time is ruled by digital pulses, microprocessors, and international time zones. It is precise to the millisecond, but it is not sacred. The monks did not measure time to be efficient. They measured it to be attuned to creation, to God, to memory. They taught us that time is not just something we use, it is something we live in. And though we rarely see it, their labor remains the scaffolding of our hours. Every calendar you hang, every schedule you keep, every year you mark as new rests, in some way on vellum scraped by a monk's hand, on ink that dried beside a flickering lamp. So perhaps next time you glance at your calendar or hear a bell in the distance, you might ask, what kind of time are we keeping, and who taught us to count it this way? Story 5, Timber and Tedium, Life in a 17th-Century Shipyard. The ship has not yet left the harbor. In fact, it has not yet floated. It rests in its skeletal form, timbers stacked and rising like a ribcage on the shore of a cold northern inlet. There is no fanfare, no battle cry, no stormy sea. Only the smell of sawdust, tar, and salt water. The year is 1673. We are in a state-run naval shipyard, perhaps in Dipford on the Thames, or Rochefort on the Atlantic coast of France. This is not a story of captains or admirals. It is not about sea battles or mutiny. It is about the quiet, grinding work of building ships, the unseen, uncelebrated labor that filled the air with hammer strikes and the cough of sawyers. It is a story of tedium and timber, of labor regulated by tide and rule, of men whose names are not remembered, but whose hands held empires afloat. Let us step inside the shipyard. The age of naval bureaucracy. By the 17th century, European powers had begun to think of ships not as independent ventures of exploration, but as tools of state policy. England, France, the Dutch Republic, and Spain all competed for naval dominance, and with that came the rise of the state-owned dockyard. Gone were the days when merchants commissioned vessels ad hoc. Now, large centralized bureaucracies like the British Navy Board and the French Marine Royale controlled every aspect of construction. They set quotas, approved designs, assigned materials, and oversaw vast workforces. A naval shipyard was, in many ways, a city within a city. Hundreds of laborers worked on ships at various stages of construction. Sawmills, foundries, tar houses, rope walks, and storehouses sprawled along the waterfront. Piles of oak, pine, fir, and elm were stacked according to thickness, length, and purpose. And overseeing it all were clerks, inspectors, and master shipwrights, armed with logbooks, compasses, and strict ledgers. It was a world of routine, tedious, repetitive, and unforgiving. The wood that built empires. At the heart of the shipyard was timber, good timber. Naval architects of the time required specific types for different parts of the hull. English oak for the frames and planking, fir or pine for masts and spars, elm for underwater components, especially the keel, due to its resistance to rot. Securing wood was itself a massive operation. Trees were often felled years in advance and seasoned dried in open yards for up to 10 years before being used. In France, royal forests were surveyed by crown officials to identify suitable trees. In England, the Navy Board issued warrants to landowners to supply specific amounts of oak. Failing to deliver could result in steep fines or land confiscation. The timber, once delivered, was graded by timber measurers who marked each beam with chalk codes and sorted them by ship type. Even at this early stage, paperwork outweighed planks. The men of the yard. The shipyard workforce was divided into specialized trades. Shipwrights, the backbone of the operation. These skilled craftsmen shaped the hull, laid the keel, and framed the vessel. Often trained through long apprenticeships, they were some of the few workers allowed to mark their own work, sometimes leaving initials carved into beams. Caulkers used oakum, hemp fiber soaked in tar, to seal joints between planks. Their work determined whether the ship would float or slowly take on water. Riggers, responsible for the vast, complex system of ropes, sails, and pulleys. Though their work was largely done once the hull was launched, they were often seen coiling rope in the long rope walks stretching out from the yard. Blacksmiths forged the iron nails, bolts, and fittings that held the wooden skeleton together. Sawyers toiled in soppets, one man above and one below, pulling a two-man saw through thick beams day after day. Covered in sawdust and sweat, they worked by muscle and rhythm. Laborers carried materials, mixed pitch, manned cranes, and shoveled debris. Often paid daily wages, they had little security and few protections. Supervising all this were clerks and foremen, who kept daily logs of progress, issued materials, and reported delays. A single ship of the line, a massive warship, could take 2 to 4 years to complete and require 2,000 mature oak trees. The paperwork alone could fill volumes. The working day. Time in the shipyard was governed by tide. The launching of ships and receiving of timber was tied to the rise and fall of the sea. Sunlight. Most work was done during daylight. Artificial lighting was minimal and dangerous around tar and sawdust. Bell and whistle. The start and end of shifts were marked by bells. Overtime was rare and hours long. There were few holidays. Only major feast days, royal birthdays, or religious festivals offered respite. Otherwise, the rhythm was constant. Measure, saw, hammer, repeat. Accidents were common. A falling spar could crush a man in seconds. Fires in the pitch house could spread fast. And sickness, especially from tar inhalation or poor sanitation, often went unrecorded but ever present. Most workers lived in poor housing near the yard. Taverns and alehouses thrived just beyond the gates. Some shipyards had internal rules limiting alcohol, others turned a blind eye. Tools and techniques. Construction was mostly manual. Tools included adzes for shaping beams, augers for drilling, mallets and chisels for fitting joints, plumb lines and measuring rods for alignment. Ship plans were often minimal. Master shipwrights kept designs in their heads, using half-hull models carved from wood as their primary reference. This oral tradition made the role of master shipwrights both powerful and irreplaceable. Errors were costly. A miscut beam could delay construction for weeks. Inspectors roamed the yard, checking angles and measurements, recording their findings in thick books stored in damp, cramped offices. Pay, discipline, and discontent. Wages varied by trade. Skilled shipwrights could earn 2-3 shillings per day. Laborers earned less than half that. Foremen were salaried and often had housing provided by the state. Payment was erratic. In both English and French yards, records show delays of weeks or months. Workers petitioned, rioted, or simply left. To maintain order, punishments were harsh. Fines for lateness or sloppiness. Dismissal for drunkenness or insubordination. Whipping or imprisonment in rare cases of theft or sabotage. But despite the hardship, many workers stayed because the shipyard, unlike seasonal farming or weaving, offered year-round employment and state protection. To build ships for the crown was, in some ways, a matter of national service, even if that pride was rarely expressed. The shipyard as a national engine. Though the work was dull and the rewards modest, shipyards were the hidden backbone of maritime empires. From the Dutch East India Company's yard in Amsterdam to the royal docks at Portsmouth, every beam driven into place was part of a larger project: control of oceans, trade routes, and colonies. Ministers and kings wrote naval strategies. Admirals drew up war plans. But none of it could happen without the sawyers, caulkers, and shipwrights laboring day after day under gray skies and over open pits. And so we must ask, how did the invisible work of shipbuilders, so repetitive and unseen, shape the rise of the world's great naval powers? And what happens to such a system when war, peace, or politics shift its priorities? By now, the hull begins to resemble a ship. Planks line the frame, pitch seals the joints, and a skeletal mast leans in weight, lashed down against the breeze. But even as the carpenter's saw and the caulker's hammer, the real activity begins elsewhere in the office, where logs are balanced, timbers are tracked, and payrolls are tallied with agonizing precision. This section explores the bureaucratic engine of the 17th-century shipyard. It is a world of forms, inspections, correspondence, and accounting, where ships take shape not just on the slipway, but in ink and paper, weeks and months before any keel is laid. Because for every ship built, there is a paper ship, a meticulous record of its parts, costs, dimensions, and labor. In the age of wooden warships, the empire is not only built of oak, but of parchment. The rise of naval administration. The 17th century marked the bureaucratization of naval power. Previously, maritime fleets were often assembled in haste, merchant vessels pressed into service, armed with rented guns, and manned by conscripted sailors. But as naval warfare evolved, states began to maintain permanent fleets. This required an entire administrative infrastructure to support. Long-term procurement of materials, management of yards and labor, storage of munitions and supplies, ongoing maintenance and refits. In England, this was the role of the Navy Board, established in the 1540s and further empowered during the Stuart period. It consisted of civilian commissioners who oversaw accounts, shipbuilding, and supply chains. They corresponded regularly with local shipyards and were notorious for their demand for detailed reporting. In France, the Colbert reforms under Louis XIV brought similar centralization. The Marine Royale, under Jean-Baptiste Colbert, maintained tight control over construction schedules, issued standard dimensions, and tracked materials with near-obsessive care. Paperwork at scale. Every ship began as a specification sheet, usually issued from a naval office in the capital. These included tonnage, number of decks and guns, dimensions of keel, beam, and draft, timber requirements in loads or tons, completion deadlines, assigned shipyard and supervisor. From there, the master shipwright would begin a flurry of calculations. Each part of the ship, the frames, knees, deck beams, masts, planking, had to be matched to available stock. Then came the timber accounts. Timber was recorded in multiple ways. Scantlings, dimensions of individual beams, e.g., 14 x 14 inches. Loads, a vague measure equivalent to a cartload of usable wood. Tons, in England, sometimes used interchangeably with volume. Board feet, in some Dutch and German contexts, measuring cut timber. Workers called clerks of the check maintained logs of all incoming materials and issued receipts for every plank. Each nail, rope, and cask of pitch had its own ledger entry. Every laborer's hours were logged in the pay book, which included name and trade, days worked, rate of pay, deductions for late arrival, damaged tools, or fines. Some shipyards even tracked tool depreciation, with forms detailing the life cycle of a single adze or saw. Letters, delays, and scandal. Shipbuilding was rarely efficient. Delays were constant. Materials arrived late, tools broke, workers left mid-construction. Letters between dockyards and naval offices reveal a constant stream of complaints and justifications. Timber requisitioned from Kent, not arrived due to poor road. The iron nails sent from Bristol were found rusted and unusable. The caulkers have struck over unpaid wages. Work on the lower deck is halted. In some cases, corruption marred operations. Dockyard officials colluded with merchants to overcharge for materials. Workers were paid for phantom days. Rotten timber was passed off as sound, leading to ships that rotted at sea within years. Inspections were meant to prevent this. Commissioners visited yards, conducted surveys, and issued progress reports. They sometimes found fraud. More often, they found overwork and fatigue. Yet despite the inefficiencies, the system functioned largely because of its scale. A global supply chain. A single 74 gunship might require 2,000 oak trees from England or the Baltic, masts from the Black Forest or New England, hemp for rigging from Russia, pitch from Sweden or Norway, canvas from Flanders, iron fittings from Swedish mines. This meant that 17th-century shipyards were global logistics hubs. Bureaucrats tracked material flows across oceans. In France, Colbert organized warehouses at Brest, Toulon, and Rochefort to stockpile naval stores. England's Chatham and Portsmouth served similar functions, with entire neighborhoods turned into storage zones. Materials were marked with paint, numbered, and listed in shipping manifests, early versions of inventory systems. Delays anywhere in this chain rippled across the empire. Naval power through accounting. At the height of its organization, the Royal Navy kept over 70 active ships of the line, each requiring constant upkeep, repair, and replacement parts. Ships were categorized not only by type, but by condition, fit, repairable, unserviceable, status at sea, in dock, under repair, outfitting level, commissioned, reserve, laid up. To track this, naval administrators built ship registers, bound volumes listing every ship by name, armament, tonnage, and construction date. Some records survive today, filled with marginal notes in ink. Leaky dry dock required. Masts replaced 1672. Assigned to East Indies, 1674. Naval strategy depended on these books as much as it did on sailors or ships. In the shipyard offices, time passed not in hammer strokes, but in ink scratches, ledgers updated, accounts balanced, deliveries checked. Empires floated on paperwork. The invisible builders. Most of those whose labor made these records possible left no trace. They appear only as John B. Sawyer, 43 days at 10D. Thomas W. Laborer, absent 2 days. Anne M. Pitchhouse, dismissed. Women, while rare in shipyard trades, sometimes worked in auxiliary roles: pitch boiling, rope spinning, and provisioning. But even these rare appearances in the logbooks are fleeting. The ship sails, the wood weathers, the names fade. And yet, without these entries, without the endless measurements, audits, and inspections, the ships could not be built. The 17th-century shipyard was an engine of slow, deliberate, frustrating production. Its outputs were not only ships but also a system, a method of rule, resource management, and industrial labor that would shape the modern Navy and, eventually, the factory. But what happens to these floating giants after their launch? How did their quiet builders understand the fate of their work once it left the yard, the shore, and the paperwork behind? The hull is sealed, the masts stand ready, cables strain against anchors, and the tides are watched closely. After years of planning, cutting, hammering, and measuring, the ship is finally prepared for launch. But what does it mean to launch a ship? What becomes of the object so many hands have shaped? And what happens to the laborers once their creation slips into the sea? This final section examines the moment of launch, the lifespan of ships built in the 17th century dockyards, and the invisible afterlife of both the vessels and the workers who made them. It is about endings, legacies, and what survives of the things we build. The launch day. Though shipbuilding was often slow and mundane, the launch was a moment of drama, especially for a royal or heavily armed ship. The ship, having been constructed on an inclined slipway, was now ready to be slid into the water. This moment required precision. The keel had to be perfectly aligned with the slope. The grease, tallow, and soap mixture rubbed along the launch rails had to reduce just enough friction. Wooden wedges, called shores, were hammered away one by one. Finally, the great ship began to move slowly at first, then gaining speed and struck the water with a dull, thudding splash. Crowds often gathered. Clergy gave blessings. A bottle of wine or sacramental oil might be dashed against the bow. In England, it was sometimes a woman of noble birth who performed the ritual of naming, one of the few sanctioned roles women played in the naval world. But for the workers, launch day was less celebratory. It meant the end of a long, demanding project and the beginning of another. Because the launch was not the end, it was only the middle. The fitting out process. Once afloat, the ship still required months of work before it could sail. Masts and rigging had to be installed by riggers and sailmakers. Cannons were hauled aboard, sometimes over 60 per ship of the line. Ballast, often stones or scrap iron, had to be packed into the hold for balance. Stores and provisions were loaded: salted meat, hardtack, water, powder, spare rope, and tools. This phase, called fitting out, was often chaotic. Equipment might be delayed, cannons mismeasured, gun carriages absent. Delays here could render the ship unusable for months, even as it appeared complete from the outside. Dockside workers continued their routines: hauling, lifting, recording, and waiting. Once complete, the ship was commissioned and handed over to its first captain. A new world now opened for the vessel, one of warfare, commerce, storms, or diplomatic posturing. For the yard laborers, however, the ship's departure meant just one thing: time to start building another. The working life of a 17th century warship. The lifespan of wooden ships was rarely more than 15 to 25 years, depending on build quality, maintenance, and luck. Some succumbed earlier, wrecked in storms or burned in battle. A few reasons for early deterioration included: poor seasoning of timber, leading to dry rot; shipworm infestations in warm waters; weak fastenings, rusted or improperly placed; design flaws, especially in the hull curvature or rudder size. When a ship showed signs of decay, it could be hauled into dry dock for repair; hulked, meaning stripped of its rigging and used as a floating warehouse or barracks; broken up, taken apart for salvageable timber and scrap iron. Interestingly, timber from decommissioned warships was often sold and reused in barns, farmhouses, furniture, even public buildings. Some architectural historians can still trace beams from naval vessels in old English country homes. The ship's body did not vanish, it was dispersed. The afterlife of the workers. For the men who built the ships, the afterlife was less visible. Many remained in the yards, laboring on the next vessel. Few were promoted. Most worked until illness or injury forced retirement. Pensions were rare, though some states offered token payments or shelter in naval hospitals for those who had served long and loyally. Names fade from the records except for the master shipwrights, whose designs and plans occasionally survive in national archives. And yet their legacy endures. Every line of a ship's hull, every twist of its keel, every carefully placed rivet. These were shaped not just by specification sheets, but by craft knowledge, passed from hand to hand, from apprentice to journeyman. A system that built empires. From a distance, the shipyard seemed like a place of mundane tedium, planks and pitch, paperwork and paint. But up close, it reveals itself as a machine of empire. Without the dockyards, troops could not be transported. Colonies could not be defended. Trade could not expand. Battles could not be fought. Every quiet motion of the sawyer, every note by a clerk, every wedge driven into place, these were acts of statecraft, even if unrecognized as such. Naval dominance was not just achieved at sea. It was constructed, line by line, nail by nail, in the background hum of the shipyard. What remains? Today, many of these old yards are vanished. The timber stores collapsed. The dry docks filled in. The rope walks turned into roads. Some, like Chatham or Rochefort, survive as museums, echoes of an age when wood ruled the waves. Visitors walk through reconstructed frames. They admire the ships. They marvel at the precision. But few pause to think about the boredom, the aches, the endless tedium that built those wonders. Few remember the men who worked day after day under overcast skies, measuring, hammering, and hopping. The clerk got their name right. And yet they are there, hidden in the timbers. So next time you see an old warship, whether on a museum dock or in a painting, ask yourself, who built this? What hands touched every beam, and what did they dream as the ship slipped away? Because even the quietest histories, those of sawdust and salt, can carry the weight of the world. Story 6. The Post Writers of Early America, delivering news 1 mile at a time. You are standing at the edge of a dirt track, somewhere in New England. The year is 1771. The road is muddy, rutted, and laced with roots. You hear hooves before you see the rider, a man in a broad-brimmed hat, coat weathered from rain, and leather saddlebags cinched tightly to a thin, tired horse. He dismounts with care. One leg swings over the horse's side and boots hit earth. No fanfare, no uniform. He opens his saddlebag, takes out a bundle wrapped in twine, and walks to the door of a tavern, not to rest, but to post a letter. This is not a courier for a king. This is a post rider, one of thousands who, before trains, before wires, before standardized routes, helped knit together the fragile fabric of early America. This story is not about declarations or revolutions. It is about the people who carried the mail quietly every day across rough country, through snow, swamp, and suspicion. It is about how a nation begins not with a bang, but with a letter, and how letters only matter if they arrive. The birth of American postal routes. The American Postal Service in the 18th century was slow to develop. Colonists in the early 1600s relied on private messengers, merchant captains, or casual travelers to deliver letters if they arrived at all. But by the 1700s, as cities grew and the need for political and economic coordination intensified, a more formal postal network emerged. This wasn't yet a centralized service. Instead, it was a patchwork of post roads, often no more than upgraded bridle paths. Riders, hired per trip or retained through contracts. Way stations, often taverns or inns, where mail could be left or picked up. The role of a post rider was pivotal but underappreciated. They were expected to ride in all weather, cover 50 to 75 miles per day, sleep little, eat less, avoid gossip, drunkenness, and political entanglements. Yet, paradoxically, they became vital carriers of information during a time when rumors could start wars. Who were the post writers? Post writers came from varied backgrounds. Many were young men, sometimes teenagers seeking adventure or a steady income. Some were veterans, accustomed to hardship and solitude. Others were African Americans, both free and enslaved, contracted for deliveries within cities or between estates. They were not government agents in the modern sense. They were freelancers, often responsible for procuring their own horses, maintaining saddlebags and equipment, navigating routes without maps. Payment came per mile or per delivery, and rates varied depending on the distance, urgency, and road condition. A typical rider carried a pair of saddlebags, waxed leather to protect against rain, a horn to announce arrival or warn animals off the road, a pouch of letters, some sealed with wax, others loosely folded. Some riders were armed, carrying pistols or knives, though rarely used them. Their greatest threat was not bandits, but weather, isolation, and worn-out horses. The postal road experience. Riding from Boston to New York or Philadelphia took 5 to 7 days, depending on weather and the state of the post roads. These roads were little more than widened animal tracks, plagued by swamps in the Carolinas, snow drifts in New England, rutted clay paths in Virginia that turned to mud with every rain. Bridges were rare. Riders often had to ford rivers on horseback. They timed their journeys carefully. Many rose before dawn to start their ride, knowing that any delay could result in missed handoffs or worse, accusations of mail tampering, a serious offense. Handoffs happened at taverns where the rider could leave or pick up mail. Postal inns, often marked with crude signs or lanterns. Local stores or churches, depending on regional arrangements. Each stop was an opportunity to gather new mail, rest the horse, and pass on news, though gossip was discouraged. Post riders became known by face and by name in small communities, and many were trusted to read letters aloud to illiterate recipients. Trust, secrecy, and surveillance. Even before the Revolution, the content of letters mattered. Governors, merchants, and political societies relied on writers to carry business contracts, news of ship arrivals, local tax disputes, sermons, pamphlets, and protest material. There was always a concern that a writer might lose a letter, open a sealed message, sell its contents to competitors or spies. As such, many letters were coded or sent using aliases. Some were double enveloped or disguised as religious tracts. Writers had to swear oaths to deliver mail with diligence and discretion. Some colonies issued fines for delays. Others simply blacklisted writers who proved unreliable. Yet despite these fears, the system worked. Slowly, letter by letter, the colonies began to connect. The long road to nation. By the 1770s, the American colonies had over 2,000 miles of post roads, dozens of official post offices, a rotating crew of riders and contractors working routes from Massachusetts to Georgia. This system laid the groundwork for political coordination between resistance groups, rapid dissemination of news, like the Boston Massacre or Tea Act, formation of the Continental Congress's own postal network. In fact, in 1775, the Congress appointed Benjamin Franklin as Postmaster General, effectively nationalizing the postal system under rebel control. But even then, it was the post riders, those muddy-booted, wind-bitten travelers, who carried the messages that held the rebellion together. So next time you read about the Founding Fathers, the fiery speeches, or the rising tide of revolution, ask yourself, who delivered the letters that made it all possible? The American Revolution is often framed through declarations, gunfire, and parchment in candlelit rooms. But long before the battles began, there were messages riding through the woods. Post riders became not just messengers but early agents of rebellion, whether they intended to be or not. As discontent simmered in the colonies and British authorities tried to suppress dissent, the post became a battleground not of armies, but of information. In this section, we'll look at how the American post evolved from a system of delivery into a vehicle of resistance, and how the riders, often uncelebrated, became the connective tissue between towns, colonies, and eventually, revolution. The trouble with British control. By the mid-1760s, the British Crown had already begun to tighten control over the colonial post. With more frequent shipments, taxation, and fears of rebellion, postal surveillance became more aggressive. The British appointed postal officials, monitored letters for subversive language, delayed or intercepted known agitators, mail, required licenses for certain deliveries, charged high postage rates, which limited communication among the lower classes. These actions didn't go unnoticed. Among the colonial merchant class, there was a growing suspicion that their letters were being read or held without cause. Post riders, who were once seen as neutral agents, were increasingly pressured to choose sides. The rise of alternative postal networks. In response to British interference, colonial leaders began to form their own shadow communication systems, often using the same post riders but now in secret. Groups like the Sons of Liberty, the Committees of Correspondence, and other early resistance networks hired trusted writers to deliver private letters beyond British detection, established parallel drop-off points such as homes, taverns, and churches, created handwritten newsletters with local news, printed in small batches and carried town to town. The post riders became crucial intermediaries in these efforts. Many of them memorized routes and names to avoid carrying incriminating lists, rode at night or through back roads to avoid capture, destroyed letters on capture, sometimes by swallowing paper or burning it. They were not soldiers, but they were deeply embedded in what one might call logistical rebellion. Paul Revere was alone. While Paul Revere's midnight ride is legendary, he was not the only or even the most frequent post rider to carry urgent warnings through the colonies. Others included William Dawes, who rode a separate route during Revere's mission in 1775, Israel Bissell, who rode from Watertown, Massachusetts, to Philadelphia, a staggering 345-mile journey in less than 5 days, shouting warnings along the way. Countless unnamed riders who carried messages between resistance cells in places like Concord, Albany, and Charleston. Unlike Revere, most of these riders did not receive dramatic paintings or immortal poems, but they performed the same work in the same weather on the same dangerous roads. Their job: deliver information faster than the British could react. Weather, risk, and injury. By now, the post roads were more than muddy paths, they were battle corridors. Riders faced new dangers. British patrol, stopping and searching for documents. Tory sympathizers, reporting riders' movements. Broken or captured horses, which could mean mission failure. Illness, especially in swampy or malarial areas, like parts of the Carolinas and Georgia. Despite these challenges, deliveries persisted. Riders used false names, changed horses more frequently, and carried duplicate letters in different locations on their person. A few went so far as to use invisible ink, a technique later adopted by American intelligence networks. And yet they remained mostly nameless. Even in letters and orders, they are often referred to simply as the rider, our messenger, a trusted man. Their identity was secondary, their task was everything. The Continental Congress steps in. In July 1775, the Continental Congress formally established its own postal system. They appointed Benjamin Franklin as Postmaster General, a network of 26 postmasters throughout the colonies, routes to facilitate correspondence between Congress and military leaders. Franklin himself, a former printer and colonial postmaster, understood the importance of reliable communication. Under his guidance, riders received uniform pay and instructions. Routes were mapped with greater consistency. Security procedures improved. But the real strength of the system still rested on individual riders who made judgment calls every day. Should they detour to avoid patrols? Can they trust the tavern keeper at the next stop? Will their horse hold out another 40 miles? There were no supervisors on the road, no radios, just gut instinct, local knowledge, and duty. Letters that changed the war. Several turning points in the early war hinged on messages delivered in time. Orders for troop movements, intelligence on British strategy, updates from militias and forts. In 1776, it was riders from New York and Virginia who carried early drafts of the Declaration of Independence to local printers. Each delivery was a gamble. If caught, riders could face flogging, imprisonment, in some cases, execution for carrying treasonous material. Yet they rode on. Because even without weapons, even without recognition, they knew that their work held the fragile future of the rebellion in its saddlebags. So when we ask how a scattered, poorly armed set of colonies managed to coordinate a revolution, the answer lies partly in this question. Who kept the silence from becoming permanent? The war came and went. The colonies became states. The Continental Congress gave way to the Constitution. Horses still clipped along the roads, but the world they served was beginning to change. This final section traces the slow disappearance of the post rider, not in a blaze of glory, but in the inevitable shuffle of innovation. We'll explore how their once critical role gave way to new systems, and how, in the process, their legacy became both absorbed and largely forgotten. This is a story not of heroes, but of systems. Not of singular men, but of how information moves and what we choose to remember when the roads go quiet. After the Revolution, a new country, a new postal vision. After American independence, the fledgling United States faced a fundamental question. How do you govern a country so large, so rural, and so fragmented? The answer in part was, build a mail system before anything else. In 1792, Congress passed the Postal Act, which officially made the U.S. Postal Service a government entity, protected mail from inspection, a reaction to British surveillance, set standardized postal rates, allowed newspapers to be sent at heavily subsidized costs, supporting public literacy and political discourse. Post roads were expanded and improved. The number of post offices exploded from just 75 in 1790 to over 900 by 1800. Mail volume increased tenfold. But these changes brought with them a new kind of rider, the contractor, often wealthier and better connected than his predecessors. Instead of lone men on muddy roads, we now saw stagecoaches carrying bundled letters, organized relay stations, riders hired not for their local knowledge, but their reliability and standardization. The independent post rider, once central, was now slowly edged out by systems designed for speed and scale. The rise of the mail coach. By the early 1800s, mail coaches began replacing individual riders on major routes. These four-wheeled carriages could carry dozens of mail bags, multiple passengers, guard personnel armed to deter bandits. Where the rider once crept along muddy paths, the coach thundered across improved roads, establishing schedules and stops enforced by federal contracts. This was a turning point in American logistics. The journey from Boston to New York, once a week-long ordeal, now took just 48 hours. Rural areas still relied on horseback, but the image of the solitary, galloping messenger began to fade. Efficiency, not resilience, became the new ideal. Legacy on the frontier. Yet not all of America urbanized quickly, as settlers moved westward. Roads vanished into forests and plains. Post offices were few and far between. The need for hardy riders, capable of handling treacherous terrain, persisted. In these frontier zones, the old post rider model endured well into the mid-19th century. Some of them rode with rifles, fearing not only bandits but wolves and starvation. Delivered to military forts, mining camps, and isolated farms. Developed personal relationships with recipients, often reading letters aloud to the illiterate. They were no longer part of a revolutionary cause, but they were still essential to connection, news, and hope. The phrase, "the mail is coming," could mean the difference between feeling part of a nation or completely forgotten. Obsolescence arrives. The arrival of the railroad in the 1830s dealt the final blow to the post rider. Trains could carry more mail, faster, over longer distances, with greater predictability. And so, within just a few decades, major post roads were rerouted to favor rail lines. Stagecoaches were reassigned to remote towns or discontinued. Horseback riders were kept only in mountainous or inaccessible regions. Eventually, even those roles faded, replaced by rural free delivery (RFD) in the 1890s, parcel post, and finally automobiles. The once indispensable post rider had become redundant, a relic of an age when information moved no faster than a galloping horse. Memory and forgetting. Curiously, few of their names were remembered. Even in towns where riders had once brought weekly news, local records rarely mentioned them. Their work was too mundane, too regular to seem worthy of memorial. There are no great monuments to the post riders of the 18th century, no heroic sculptures or postage stamps in their honor. They were not celebrated as inventors or founders, though they helped deliver the messages that made invention and founding possible. Their legacy survives in subtler ways. The layout of old roads, still following the curves their horses once trod. The taverns turned town halls, where they used to leave bundles of letters. The democratic ideal that information should be shared, not hoarded. They may have disappeared from view, but their labor built the nervous system of a republic. A final ride. Imagine, then, a rider in 1780, just another quiet day. He rises early, checks the weathered leather straps on his saddlebag, nods to the innkeeper, and swings into the saddle. In his bag, a half-dozen personal letters, a request for supplies from an army captain, a newspaper filled with essays about freedom. He does not write these things. He does not argue them. He does not command troops or draft legislation. But without him, without his steady ride through snow and heat, forest and field, none of it would matter. Words unread are just silence. So he rides. So next time you hold a letter, or open an inbox, or receive a message that shifts your day, pause to remember those who once brought news at a horse's pace, over days and nights, through a country not yet sure of itself. And ask yourself, what does it take to keep a country connected? Before the wires, before the wheels, before anyone even agreed it was a country at all.